ever get that feeling? Like when you ask an AI a question
Yeah.
and it just spits back an answer instantly, it's
Yeah.
like, did you even think about it?
Yeah.
Or on the flip side, it just rambles on and on with this never-ending thought process. It's like, come on already, get to the point.
Right. It makes you wonder if it's actually thinking or just, spinning its wheels.
Finding that sweet spot, that just right amount of thinking time for AI, it's a real head scratcher, isn't it?
It really is. And it's actually a core challenge in AI research right now. How do you give these really powerful reasoning models the ability to, think just long enough to get the right answer?
Right.
Enough to be accurate, but not so much that it becomes a huge computational drain.
Exactly. Because you don't want to waste resources, but you also need the AI to be reliable. That balance is key, especially if you're thinking real-world applications.
Absolutely. Efficiency and accuracy. It's a tough balancing act.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. Some researchers at Carnegie Mellon University are tackling this very issue.
Oh.
They're figuring out how to give us the reins, how to actually control how long an AI model thinks.
Now that's fascinating. That level of control could be a game changer. What's their approach?
Well, the paper we're looking at today is called Controlling How Long a Reasoning Model Thinks with Reinforcement Learning.
Okay, so reinforcement learning, that's a pretty popular approach in AI these days.
It is. And in this case, they're using it to literally teach the AI how to manage its own thinking time. So your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to understand how this new research is allowing us to actually control the thinking time of these language models.
I'm in. Sign me up. This sounds like a deep dive I don't want to miss.
You and me both. We're going to explore the benefits of having this kind of control, and honestly, you're going to be surprised by some of the unexpected abilities that have popped up as a result.
Yeah, can't wait to hear about those surprises. But first, let's break it down. How are they achieving this control? What's the secret sauce?
All right, so the key ingredient here is a method called Length-Controlled Policy Optimization, or LCPO for short.
LCPO. Got it.
You can think of it as a special training regime for the AI.
Ah, so they're training the model itself to be mindful of its thinking time.
Exactly. Now, at its heart, LCPO is a reinforcement learning technique.
Okay, I get that reinforcement learning is like rewarding good behavior, but how does it apply to thinking time?
Think of it like this. You want to teach your dog a new trick, right? You give it a treat when it does something right.
Sure, classic positive reinforcement.
In this case, there are two things that this LCPO training is trying to reward in the model. First, of course, is getting the right answer. Accuracy is still super important.
Makes sense. That's the whole point, right?
But here's where it gets interesting. The second thing they reward is sticking to a specific length limit for its reasoning process, like a limit that you set beforehand.
Oh, so you're saying it's not just about getting the right answer, but also about getting there within a certain time frame?
Exactly. You're not giving it an unlimited amount of time to think. It's about solving it correctly and showing its work within a certain token budget.
Token budget. I like that. So basically limiting the number of words or parts of words it uses in its internal reasoning.
Precisely. They're not letting it ramble on forever. And with LCPO, you, the user, can actually prompt the model by specifying a target token length. It's like saying, hey, reason this out in about 500 tokens.
Wow, that's really direct. You're giving the AI a word limit for its thinking. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Or you could say, don't let your thought process exceed 1,500 tokens. You're giving it clear boundaries.
I see. So it's like setting guidelines for how much internal monologue the AI is allowed to have.
Precisely. Now, the paper mentions they experimented with two main ways of enforcing these length limits with LCPO. LCPO Exact and LCPO Max.
Okay, two different flavors of LCPO. What's the difference?
LCPO Exact is the strict one. It's like, I told you 750 tokens, so stick to 750 tokens. It aims for the AI's reasoning to be almost exactly the target length you gave it.
So if you're really specific about how long you want the AI to think, you go with LCPO Exact. What about LCPO Max?
LCPO Max is a bit more flexible. It says, okay, you can be shorter than the limit, but absolutely no longer. It's like setting an upper bound.
Gotcha. So if you're more concerned about staying under a certain computational cost, LCPO Max gives you that leeway.
Exactly. It's about having options, right? So they developed these LCPO methods, and then they put them to the test by training a specific language model.
Okay, what kind of model are we talking about here?
They called it L1, and it's based on an existing model called Quinn Distilled R1 1.5b. It's a 1.5 billion parameter model, so pretty substantial.
Right, so that's their base engine. And then they used LCPO to train it to control its thinking time.
Exactly. And what they found is that L1 can do some really interesting things. One of the most impressive is its ability to trade off between how much computation it uses the token budget and how accurate its answers are.
Wait, so you can tell it to think less and maybe be a little less accurate, or to think more and be more precise?
You got it. And the amazing thing is it achieves this simply by changing the length constraint in the prompt. It's all about how you instruct it.
Wow, that's powerful. You're essentially giving the user control over the trade-off between speed and accuracy.
Exactly. So you can tailor its thinking to the specific task at hand. And what's really cool is that at a certain point in this spectrum, L1 actually performs just as well as the original base model, the one that wasn't even trained with these length constraints.
So it's not like this control is holding it back. It can still reach the same level of performance as its unconstrained counterpart.
Exactly. It's just a matter of finding the right balance. Now, this research also compared L1 to a previous method for controlling reasoning length called S1.
Okay, so how does L1 stack up against the competition? What was the approach behind S1?
S1 was this kind of budget forcing technique. Imagine you're having a conversation and you just put your hand over someone's mouth to stop them from talking.
Oh, a bit forceful, not exactly subtle.
That's S1 in a nutshell. It involved things like telling the model to insert special placeholder tokens if it wasn't generating enough output, like a digital equivalent of, wait, let me think more.
Interesting. So kind of forcing it to pause if it was being too concise?
Right, or they'd just cut off its reasoning abruptly if it exceeded the limit. Very blunt.
Not the most elegant approach. So how did L1, with its more controlled thinking, compare to S1's brute force methods?
The results were pretty dramatic. L1 outperformed S1 significantly across a range of reasoning lengths. We're talking up to 100% relative improvement and a 20% absolute improvement on math tasks.
Wow, those are some serious gains. That's a clear indication that LCPO is a much more effective approach than just trying to force the model into a certain length.
Yeah, it's about finesse, not force. The researchers believe this big difference in performance comes down to a few key things. First, L1 learns to adapt its reasoning strategy to fit within those length constraints.
It's like instead of being told to shut up, it's learning how to summarize its thoughts effectively.
Exactly. It can condense or expand its thought process without losing the logic. S1, on the other hand, with its abrupt interruptions, often ended up disrupting the reasoning itself.
It's like the difference between carefully editing a long article down to a concise summary versus just chopping off the last few paragraphs.
Right. It's about preserving the flow of thought. Another reason L1 shines is that it's specifically trained to generate high-quality reasoning at various lengths. It learns how to be both concise and comprehensive, depending on what's needed.
So it's not just a one-trick pony, it's flexible and adaptable. That's really impressive.
Now, another fascinating aspect they looked at is how L1's problem-solving ability changed as they gave it more space to think, a bigger token budget.
So basically, how does its performance scale with more thinking time?
Exactly. And what they found is this log linear scaling pattern. It's a trend they've seen with other large language models as well.
Okay, so log linear scaling. Can you break that down for us non-mathematicians?
Basically, as you give it proportionally more tokens to think, its performance tends to improve in a roughly linear fashion.
So more thinking time, better results. Makes sense. But was there anything special about L1's scaling compared to other models?
The interesting thing with L1 is that its improvement curve had a shallower slope compared to S1.
Okay, shallower slope. What does that actually mean in practical terms?
Think of it like this. Some AI models are really slow learners. You have to give them a ton of extra thinking time to see even a small improvement.
Ah, so they're not very efficient with their thinking resources.
Exactly. But with L1, even small increases in the token budget lead to noticeable improvements in its problem-solving ability. It's more efficient, especially compared to S1.
So it's getting more bang for its buck, so to speak. It doesn't need to think for ages to make significant progress.
Precisely. That's a big win for managing computational costs. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. This ability to manage its thinking time isn't just limited to the tasks L1 was specifically trained on. It can actually generalize to new types of problems.
Oh, really? So it's not just memorizing answers, it's actually learning how to reason in a more general way.
That's the exciting part. They tested L1 on a few datasets it had never seen before, GPQA and LSAT, which are designed to assess general reasoning skills, and MMLU, which covers a broad range of general knowledge topics.
Okay, so throwing it some curveballs, how did it handle these unseen challenges?
For GPQA and LSAT, they saw the same trend. As they increased the token budget, L1's performance improved. In fact, it often matched the performance of their unconstrained baseline model, Agentica 4K, even with those strict length limits.
That's impressive. It's like it's figured out how to be both controlled and comprehensive in its thinking.
Exactly. Now, on MMLU, the general knowledge test, the improvements with increased token budget were less pronounced.
Interesting. So the benefits of longer thinking time weren't as clear-cut for factual recall. Why do you think that is?
Well, the researchers think it's because for many knowledge-based questions, the answer is either already stored in the model's memory or it's not. You can't really reason your way to knowing something you haven't learned before.
That makes sense. If the knowledge isn't there, no amount of thinking is going to magically produce it.
Right. But even though the impact on accuracy was less dramatic for factual recall, the control over reasoning length was still there. Now let's talk about how accurately L1 sticks to those length constraints. Like if you ask for 600 tokens, does it actually deliver something close to that?
It's like, is it actually following the rules you've set for it?
Exactly. And the results are pretty encouraging. For those math reasoning datasets, they found a really low average error in the generated length compared to the target length, only about 3%.
So it's pretty much hitting the mark when it comes to staying within the token budget.
Yeah, very precise. Now, on those more challenging out-of-domain datasets, the error rates were higher, ranging from about 20% to 40%.
Okay, so a bit more wiggle room there.
But still, it's significantly better than having no control at all. And interestingly, the larger errors on those out-of-domain tasks tended to happen when they gave the model a larger token budget.
So when it has more space to think, it's more likely to overshoot the target length.
Especially on datasets like MMLU, where more reasoning isn't always beneficial.
So it seems like when L1 is on less familiar ground, it might have a harder time judging how much thinking is actually needed to get to the answer.
That's a good observation, and that's where the trade-offs come in. The researchers also did some extra training to create a model called L1 exact plus Curran. This extra training significantly reduced the length error.
So it was even better at sticking to the limits.
But they did notice a slight dip in its peak performance on some tasks. It seems like being super strict about the length might sometimes prevent the model from exploring those really complex lines of thought that are needed for the toughest problems.
So there's a trade-off between precision and flexibility.
Exactly. Finding the right balance is key. Now, here's where the paper drops a real bombshell. They discovered what they call an unexpected short chain of thought capability that emerged from this LCPO training.
Unexpected. Color me intrigued. What exactly does that mean?
Brace yourself, because this is wild. They found that when these LCPO trained models, especially L1, were asked to do short reasoning, they actually outperformed not just their original non-length controlled counterparts, but even much larger models like GPT-4o when given the same limited token budget.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying a smaller model, trained with LCPO, can actually beat a much larger model when it comes to short, snappy reasoning?
That's exactly what they found. And the improvements were substantial, sometimes up to 10% compared to their base model, and about 2% on average over GPT-4o.
That's huge. It completely challenges the assumption that bigger is always better, even for quick thinking. What's the secret behind this unexpected strength?
The researchers believe it's because LCPO training, by forcing the model to be efficient with its thinking, might actually be distilling more effective, concise reasoning strategies.
It's like it's learning to cut to the chase and get to the core of the problem more quickly.
Precisely. And it does this without sacrificing accuracy. It's a win-win. It suggests that training models to be mindful of their thinking time might be a more efficient path to high performance overall, regardless of whether you need a quick answer or a deep analysis.
So it's not just about making them think faster, it's about making them think smarter.
Exactly. Now, they also looked at how L1's reasoning approach changes depending on the token budget it's given. They wanted to understand if it was actually adapting its thinking style.
So, like, does it think differently when it has more time versus when it's on a tight schedule?
Exactly. And they did this by analyzing the frequency of specific keywords in the generated reasoning at different lengths. They compared short outputs of about 512 tokens to much longer outputs of up to 4096 tokens.
Okay, so they're looking for clues in the language itself to understand how the reasoning process changes.
Precisely. And they categorize these keywords based on the type of reasoning they usually indicate. Things like self-correction, exploring alternatives, setting up the context of the problem, and drawing final conclusions.
Interesting. So what did they find? Did they notice any significant differences in how L1 reasoned at different lengths?
They did. For example, keywords associated with self-correction, like correction or actually, And conclusion drawing, like therefore or thus, appeared much more frequently in the longer outputs.
Ah, so when it has more time to think, it spends more time checking its work and making sure its final answer is solid. Makes sense.
Right. It's like it's more thorough and deliberate in its thinking when it has the space. Now, interestingly, keywords related to exploring alternative, like alternatively, didn't show the same increase in longer outputs.
So when it has more time, it's not necessarily exploring more options, it's focusing on refining its initial approach.
That's a good observation. It might be a sign of increased confidence in its first line of reasoning when it has more time to think it through.
Makes sense. It's like, okay, I've had time to really consider this and I'm sticking with my initial plan.
Exactly. And overall, they found that the fundamental reasoning patterns were present at both shorter and longer lengths. But with these shifts in emphasis, depending on the token budget, it's like it's adapting its strategy to the available resources.
So it's not just thinking more or less, it's thinking differently. It's tailoring its approach to the situation.
Exactly. They also looked at the ratio of tokens used for actual thinking versus the tokens used for the final solution. And what they found is that this ratio remained fairly consistent across different generation lengths.
Okay, so even when the overall reasoning is shorter, it still dedicates a similar proportion of its thinking to the intermediate steps. It's not just cutting corners.
Exactly. It's scaling its internal thinking process efficiently, no matter how long or short it is. Now, with all these impressive capabilities, especially that amazing performance in short reasoning scenarios, the question of memorization versus generalization comes up.
Of course. Is it really learning to reason, or is it just parroting back things it's seen before?
That's a crucial question. So to address this, they evaluated L1 on a dataset called AAE 2025. Now, here's the kicker. This is a challenging math exam that was released after all the models were trained, including L1.
Ah, so it's a completely fresh challenge, a true test of its reasoning abilities.
Exactly. And what they found is that the performance drop for L1 on this brand new dataset was smaller compared to other models, even much larger ones.
So it held its own against the big guys, even on a test it had never seen before. That's a strong indicator that it's not just memorizing, it's actually generalizing its reasoning skills.
Exactly. And that adds even more weight to the significance of this LCPO approach. It's not just a trick, it's a genuine step forward in AI reasoning capabilities. Now, they also briefly touched on the comparison between parallel scaling, like getting multiple reasoning paths and voting on the best answer, versus this sequential scaling we've been talking about, where you just increase the length of a single chain of thought.
Okay, so two different ways to scale up the reasoning process. What were their main takeaways there?
Their analysis generally showed that sequential scaling, giving the model a longer token budget for a single in-depth thought process, tended to be more effective at the same computational cost.
So focusing the computational power on one long train of thought is generally more efficient.
However, they also observed that L1 Max, their version trained with that maximum length constraint, benefited quite a bit from majority voting compared to a baseline model.
Interesting. So even though focusing on one long reasoning path is generally better, there's still value in getting multiple opinions from a model trained with length control.
Especially for that LCPO Max variant. It suggests that these LCPO-trained models might be particularly good at generating diverse, yet still relevant reasoning paths, making that collective wisdom more reliable.
I see. So it's like harnessing the power of multiple perspectives, but within a controlled framework.
Now, to really illustrate the impact of this controlled reasoning length, the paper includes some visual examples.
Oh, I love those. They really bring the concepts to life.
One striking example showed L1 Exact tackling a complex math problem, but with two different token budgets. A short one of 512 tokens and a much larger one of 3,600 tokens. And what was amazing is that with the shorter budget, the model tried its best, but got the answer wrong.
So even though it was being efficient, it didn't have enough thinking power to crack the problem.
But when it was given that larger budget, it was able to work through the problem step by step, explore all the necessary details, and finally arrive at the correct solution.
Ah, so it was like it needed that extra space to fully understand the complexities of the problem.
Exactly. It shows that it's not just about arbitrarily increasing the length. It's about providing that necessary cognitive workspace for the model to really grapple with the challenge.
And LCPO gives us the tools to manage and optimize that workspace. It's like being able to fine-tune the thinking process itself.
Precisely. All right, let's wrap this up. What are the key takeaways here? What do we want our listeners to remember about L1 and length controlled policy optimization.
I think the biggest takeaway is that LCPO is a major step forward in our ability to control how long language models think. It's precise, it's dynamic, and it leads to more efficient use of resources.
And don't forget that surprising finding. Models trained for long, detailed reasoning can also be incredibly good at short, efficient reasoning.
Absolutely. The fact that L1 can excel in both scenarios, even outperforming much larger models in the latter case, opens up a whole new world of possibilities for building more powerful and versatile AI systems.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder. How might this ability to manage the thinking time of AI change the way we use it in our lives? Think about everything from answering quick questions to tackling complex scientific problems.
Yeah, the potential applications are vast.
What happens to the cost and efficiency of AI applications when we have this level of control over their internal deliberations? And what are the ethical considerations? What are the potential downsides?
That's a really important point. As we gain more control over AI, we also need to be mindful of the potential consequences.
Absolutely. It's a powerful tool, and with great power comes great responsibility.
Right.
So as we continue to explore this new frontier of AI, let's do so with both excitement and caution.
I completely agree. This is an exciting time for AI research, and it's crucial that we approach these advancements with a balanced perspective.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and be sure to check out the show notes for links to the research paper and other resources. Until next time.
It's been a pleasure.